It's David from Davis Distribution here. I want to thank you guys for joining us on today's TechLogix webinar. Today with us we have Cameron Smith. He's actually the owner and CEO of TechLogix. He also sweeps the floor. So if you guys do have any questions or anything like that, he'd love to answer them. But if you can, please hold those till the end of the webinar. And also if you guys can mute your phones so there's no background noise or anything like that, we'd really appreciate it. So thank you, Cameron, for doing this for us, and the floor is yours.
All right. Thank you for inviting me today, and you are absolutely correct. I sweep the floors. That's kind of the culture at TechLogix. Everybody's in it together. I also do a lot of training. It's actually one of the things I really like to do. You see the little CEDIA logo on this webinar deck. This is the training that I do for CEDIA, and we typically will do a couple of different trainings. We'll do live workshops. We'll be setting some of those up in some areas around you next year, I'm sure, where we teach people how to terminate. But we also obviously do a lot of online trainings. And this is not a product pitch. This is not, hey, come buy TechLogix stuff. It's the latest and the greatest. This is all about fiber. And this is one of our most popular sessions because everybody's looking at fiber optic technology now for a couple of different reasons. You know, we talk about 8K, we're talking about networks and more bandwidth flowing over those networks, and how do I build a system that's immune to lightning and things like that. Well, fiber is where people are going, and frankly, with the amount of bandwidth we're pushing today, we got to look at these optical networks. And TechLogix is all about fiber, but again, this session that we will look at today is more about generic products, selecting different products, making sure you're comfortable with the different acronyms, the different types of fibers, how we go about selecting systems, and then ultimately creating those systems, the electronics, things like that. So let's go ahead and start with why fiber optics. What are we talking about here? What are the different parts of the system? So I'm a big believer that fiber is the future of AAV. You know, there are other technologies out there. 5G, you know, wireless signals. There's starting to be a lot of conversation around that. Well, as our technology continues to evolve, we continue to need more bandwidth. And as we need more bandwidth, well, we got to go to a cable that can support that bandwidth. Now, here's the good news for people who are really familiar with, you know, HDMI cables and twisted pair cables, these copper-based infrastructures that we've worked with for years and years. Fiber is really not that different. So we have bulk cable, right? Obviously, anytime we go out there and we do an installation, we typically are working with something like a bulk cable. Well, fiber is available as a bulk cable. And, you know, for people, I get a lot of questions from people who've done fiber in the past, who worked with it for years, right? Maybe 20 years ago, they put fiber in the home or they wired fiber in businesses. Well, the good news here is fiber is very different today. You know, the technology over the last 2 to 3 years, and we'll talk more about this, it's really evolved. So this bulk cable that used to be really hard to work with, that used to be really expensive to buy the equipment to work with it, it's different today. I mean, we're talking like a $500 investment puts you in the fiber business. You can work within the field. You can terminate it. You can get these connectors on in less than a minute. So it's a very different conversation. But definitely bulk cable will be part of your ecosystem. And that bulk cable is available in different types of formats, like direct burial, tactical cables, water-rated, UV-rated cables. So everything you've been pulling in a Cat5, Cat6, Cat6A format, that's available in a fiber cable. Now, what is very interesting is we see a lot of patch cords and pre-mades going out into the field. These are cables that come pre-terminated. So, you know, you can think of this as that jumper cable in your rack. That's what a patch cord is, versus a pre-made. So this is like that 650-foot gate cam run or that 1,250-foot building-to-building fiber. These can all be built and delivered as pre-terminated, pre-made cables. And that business is actually really strong and growing because as people embrace fiber, they just want it to come terminated, ready to pull, make it easy. Specialty cables, all these armored and tacticals and hybrids, things like that, that's available. But here's where it gets really interesting, because those people who've been pulling fiber 20 years ago, 10 years ago, right, they pulled it, they never really used it. These are the guys that in these training sessions, they'll be like, hey, Cameron, this is great. We're talking about fiber, but is it real? Are we really going to use it? The bottom thing here, signal distribution electronics, is really what makes the conversation different, because 20 years ago, 10 years ago, even 3 years ago, all that fiber that got pulled, there was nothing in the AV ecosystem that connected to it. Well, guess what? That's different. There is technology now. There are extenders. These things look like HD-based T extenders. Obviously, it's not HD-based T technology, but they look the same. We'll look at those here in a minute. Extenders can connect to this fiber, and now we can use fiber for audiovisual signals. We can use fiber for high bandwidth networking. There is electronics in the market now. There are electronics in the market now that let us use fiber for a real-world installation, and that's what really makes it different. Here's the important part. So if you walk away with nothing else from this webinar we're doing right now, try to latch on to why fiber. Why are we talking about this? And this is the part where I will tell folks that this is not the only training we do around fiber. Okay, this is not the only conversation that you'll be having with TechLogix and with Davis. There's lots of different trainings that we'll get into, like upselling fiber, troubleshooting fiber, that will go into more detail around this whole why fiber conversation and how we can translate this into your ultimate customer pitch, right, your sales pitch. But just for intents and purposes here, why fiber? The big, most pressing issue in the audiovisual industry right now, the CI industry, the commercial industry, is all about high definition signals. And this is one of my favorite slides in this entire training deck, because this starts to tell the story of an issue we're all running into. So we're all familiar with this evolution from standard definition, right, that 4:3 aspect ratio, into 1080p, into 4K. Now, what a lot of people don't realize is that 4K, so, today we're pulling like 4K 60, 444, some people call it 18 gig HDMI, some people call it HDR HDMI, whatever you call it, the point is the bandwidth required for a native 4K 60, 444 signal, if we have HDR, if we're sending, these signals from point A to point B and really leveraging our displays, that requires 18 gig of bandwidth. A Cat5 cable, a Cat5e cable, a Cat6a cable, so the really high bandwidth, like the expensive copper cable that we're pulling, the twisted pair cable we're pulling, that maxes out at 10 gig. We have a problem moving bandwidth with the technology that we're working with today. A 10 gig cable is being required to send an 18 gig signal. Now, we can do this. We can do this by taking the color space of that 18 gig, that 444, and compressing it down to 420. So basically, we take a big signal, an 18 gig signal or a 14 gig signal or a 12 gig signal. We compress it down to like 8 gig. And by compressing it down to 8 gig, we can move that signal over the copper twisted pair. And I like this chart because it kind of tells the story that 4K is not 4K. It depends on what we're doing with this. What's the actual resolution? What's the frame rate? What's our color space compression? What's our color bit depth? Are we working with HDR or not? But the punchline is the signals we are sending today cannot natively go over a twisted pair. We have to compress the color space. Our extenders do that. Lots of other manufacturers' extenders do that. We compress that color space, and by doing that, now some people call it invisible. Some people say, you'll never see it. The reality is when you compress a color space, you'll see color banding. It's hard to see it in, moving motion picture, but it's there. It's not ideal. We can do it for 4K. It's not ideal. Here's the issue. 8K is released. In January, HDMI 2.1 hits the market, right? The chips become available, the specs released. Cydia, anybody who went to Cydia this year, you saw the 8K displays and projectors from a bunch of manufacturers. Sony's shipping, Samsung shipping, JVC shipping, Sharp shipping. This will be the first consumer holiday season where 8K displays are readily available in the consumer marketplace. This is real. 8K will require up to 48 gig of bandwidth. 48 gig bandwidth is too much bandwidth to effectively compress down to get over a 10 gig cable. You just can't do it effectively. So all of this consumer technology that we have been, waiting for, right, drive the CI industry, new 8K displays, new 8K projectors. Well, guess what? We have a problem cabling for these devices because they will require up to 48 gigs in bandwidth, and that is not going to be served by a copper infrastructure. We have an issue. And this is why so many integrators, so many designers, they're looking for that next technology that will allow us to use an 8K signal or send an 8K signal. And here's the thing. I often get asked questions about, is 8K real, right? Great, we have 8K displays. Is there any content? Are we really going to be using this? 8K is very different than 1080p or 4K or things like 3D. There is 8K content. In fact, there's a lot of 8K content. The problem has been there's been no way to broadcast the 8K to the home. And even if we could get those signals to the home, there's really been no way to see that 8K content because there's been no displays. There's been no projectors. So this hasn't been a conversation up until really January of this year. Well, the display and projector conversation goes away. They're selling now. People are selling the 8K peripherals. I was in Chicago on Tuesday meeting with one of our partners in Chicago. They're already selling the 8K projectors, right? They're moving. That turns us towards the content conversation. I mentioned there's a lot of 8K content. There is. And the best example I have for 8K content is anybody who watches sports, right? Before we started the call, we were talking about, baseball and football. Instant replays. When you're watching football, for example, and you see the instant replay and the zoom in on the ball on the goal line, that zoom is not a telephoto lens. That zoom is because an 8K signal has been used to capture the game, right? We're using an 8K camera to record the game. Now, what's happened historically is we take that 8K, we sample it down for broadcast, and then it's transmitted out to the home and, either 720p, 1080p, or, maybe 4K. But the 8K content exists. And 8K will be distributed to the home very differently than what we're used to. This is not a broadcast standard. The content is being captured for broadcast. But 8K will be streamed to the home through media players. And that streaming is going to require a network connection that's fiber optic, because now we're moving all of this bandwidth. And by the way, even if you don't have fiber to the home, right, you got your copper infrastructure, your traditional DSL or whatever it may be, you still can download the 8K content to your media player. It's just going to take longer. But then you're going to need fiber to move that signal effectively in the home. So we're still talking about fiber optic infrastructures for our network to move these 8K signals, but also fiber optic infrastructures, fiber optic cables to get the signal from that media player to the display if the length is more than 10 to 12 feet, because even these HDMI cables that are rated for 8K, they have copper. Copper can't handle that much bandwidth over a long haul. So this is where we're seeing a lot of interest and a lot of growth in the fiber optic network. But this is not only a video conversation. This is also a global network conversation. In the average U.S. middle-class home, right now, right, this year, the average middle-class home has 23 connected devices. And these are web-connected devices. And I mean, historically, we think of things like phones and tablets and computers. But the modern home, everything's getting connected. Appliances, our thermostats, our security systems, our wearables, like our watches, right? Toys. I've got little kids. Toys are becoming Wi-Fi connected. That number, that 23 average connected devices in the home, is expected to double over the next 2 years, right? This is a CES statistic. I actually think that's pretty conservative. I mean, when we look at the cost of wireless circuits, they're frankly, they're plummeting in price. It's really easy to make something web-enabled now, and that is just driving everything to become connected. This number is going to explode. And as we see more demand for streaming media players, and the average person is using, you know, a streaming service to watch their TV, to listen to their music, and you couple that with all these connected devices, we need a cable that can move this amount of bandwidth. So before we turn this session into, you know, the different types of cables, and I promise we're going to do that here in about 30 seconds to a minute, there's a couple of other major benefits that you need to be aware of with fiber optic cabling. And immunity is a big thing. So fiber doesn't transmit power, okay? The downside to that is we can't power our devices off of that fiber optic cable run like we could with a twisted pair cable. We got to put power at the ends of the cable. Now, in the case of a lot of extenders and technology like that, they're actually powered by the HDMI port, or they're powered by a USB port, or, you know, traditionally powered by the, you know, AC outlet, the power outlet, right? But you have to power your devices. Fiber doesn't transmit power. The advantage of that is that means fiber is immune to lightning, static electricity, surges, and, you know, old cities, you know, old power infrastructures, power grids where you've got multiple different ground potentials. Fiber's immune to all of that. It's also immune to electromagnetic interference, radio interference. It's why we see it in medical and government. It's a very high reliable immune cable to all of these issues that people run into with traditional twisted pair installations. I usually use the example of if you've ever had a twisted pair, you know, like an HD-based T extender installation. So first thing is they tell you never to trunk cables. You're never supposed to Velcro those together, zip tie them together, because when you do that, you create crosstalk. The number one issue you run into with crosstalk issues in an installation is you'll have a picture, everything looks great, but then you'll lose that sync, right? Your picture looks great. It may even be stable for a week, and then all of a sudden, screen goes out. You got to go on site. You got to power cycle the extender. Maybe great for 10 days, maybe great for 3 days, but then you lose that signal again. That's usually caused by interference. Or you have a picture, it's great, it's there. Every 10 seconds it blips out. It's usually interference. Fiber is immune to that. Zero issues with that. Fiber is also a non-corrosive. So we don't, a non-corrosive cable, it's non-metallic. We don't have to worry about that cable degrading over time from being exposed to the elements. And now granted, you get different jackets on the cables for, you know, water ratings and direct burial ratings and things like that, but fiber's not it's not a corrosive and also conductive cable, as I mentioned. Here's the important thing. Fiber is much easier to handle. You can learn how to terminate this fiber in about 10 minutes. You can terminate the connectors in the field in about, you know, 1 minute. The termination kits are like $500. So the whole fiber experience for the integrators has just radically changed over time. And it's also much more affordable and profitable. profit's such an important thing when we're talking about a disruptive technology, which arguably fiber is. It's a new technology moving into the CI industry. You got to make money on it. So these cables that you're buying for like 39 cents a foot, the average markup price is $1.50 a foot. You can make money on this. You should make money on this. Keep that in context. We have all kinds of other training sessions that go into much more detail on this. Today we're not going to spend a lot of time because we have some other stuff we got to roll through. So let's turn our attention to the different types of fiber. So these are the different constructions of fiber, I should say. There's 4 predominant constructions that you're going to run into. Simplex, which is one strand. And I still make the mistake of calling, the fiber strands conductors. They're not conductors. You're not conducting anything. It's non-metallic, right? We call these strands. And a simplex fiber has one strand of fiber, whereas a duplex fiber has 2 strands of fiber. Those 2 strands of fiber allow you to send 2 signals simultaneously. And if we move to a breakout fiber, we run into multiple strands. Micro-distribution fiber, multiple strands. In fact, you can get these cables with, 2, 4, 6, 12, 24, all the way up to 96 individual strands of fiber. And the cool thing is you can get a 24-strand cable, right? 24 different strands. Each of those strands is a pipe for sending signals. That cable is the size of a pencil. Fiber is incredibly small, and it's also incredibly durable. So we have simplex on here with this one strand of fiber. I will tell you that you will almost never want to purchase simplex fiber. Okay, you may have an extender like TechLogix makes twisted or fiber optic extenders that use one strand. You only need one piece of fiber to transmit your high definition HDMI from point A to point B. However, you will almost never pull it. And the reason why is because networking almost never uses simplex fiber in the home. You always have at least duplex to transmit and receive signals. So if you're future-proofing an installation, you'll want duplex fiber at a minimum. The difference between a breakout fiber and a micro-distribution fiber, so both kinds of fiber have multiple strands. Breakout fiber just has a heavier jacket on the internal strands, so they're a little bit more durable. We'll look at this here in a little bit more detail, but before we do that, let's talk about the fiber optic cable construction. And this is a part that I usually like to do live because, we actually take a cable, we open it up, we see the different parts, but here's the thing that you're going to run into. There's a couple of different core parts to the cable jacket. This is what we see on the outermost part of the cable. That cable jacket is going to give you your different ratings, whether it's UV ratings or plenum ratings or water ratings. That's usually part of that jacket. Now, one of the most characteristic parts of the cable is the strengthening fibers. These are also called aramid yarn, or in the case of the fiber that we make, Kevlar. So this yarn-like material in the fiber optic cable is actually made of Kevlar. And the advantage to making these yarns out of Kevlar is fiber optic cables have a 220-pound pull rating. These things are incredibly strong. You can, literally tie these cables between 2 guys and do a tug of war. That's how strong these fiber optic cables are. And that's thanks to the aramid yarn or Kevlar inside that cable. Now, often that yarn is also coated in additional waterproofing gel, and it's not that you worry about like water getting in and corroding the cable. It's fiber or it's a polymer. You don't have to worry about that, right? What you do worry about is if you're putting this cable in like conduit and there's freeze cycles. That freezing can compress the cable and then uncompress the cable. And over time, that can have a detrimental effect on our cabling, whether it's fiber or twisted pair. It doesn't matter what it is. freeze cycles are bad for cables. The coating that goes on that Kevlar really gives you an extra buffering protection. So it helps preserve your cable for 20, 30, 40, 50 plus years. Once we get past the strengthening fibers, we get into the actual cable coating, cladding, and core. Fiber is glass, okay? Now you can make fiber in a couple of different constructions, but the fiber optics that we're seeing in AV, and TechLogix isn't really the only company making fiber this way, but this is a very different way. The AV types of fibers are a very different construction than what we've seen historically. And the difference is that glass, that core piece of glass inside the cable, is coated with a polymer. The polymer is what gives the fiber its durability and its bend rating. So these modern fibers that we're working with in AV, whether you're getting these from, TechLogix or a bunch of different manufacturers, and I try to build different manufacturer slides, obviously, in this deck, considering it's a CEDIA deck, these cables can literally be tied in knots without breaking. Incredibly durable fiber cables. It's what allows you to work with these things in the field. So it's a very different experience than what folks are used to working with if they've used fiber 5, 10, 15, 20 years in the past. So let's look at these cables in a little bit more depth here. So I mentioned Simplex. You will almost never want to install Simplex fiber, but it is out there. Simplex is one strand of fiber under a single jacket. So we only have one strand of fiber to work with. As I mentioned before, in a residential or a commercial application, a network application, you almost always need at least two strands of fiber. One strand to transmit, one strand to receive. Even if your electronics use a Simplex connection, and again, we make electronics with the Simplex connection. The optical engines allow you to do that. You are not future-proofing by putting in Simplex. You cannot upgrade those electronics to something else very easily. You need at least duplex. Duplex being two strands of fiber. Two strands of fiber is going to, and more often than not, this is a Siamese construction, so a zip cord construction in the fiber, two strands of fiber running side by side. And this is going to give you that bi-directional communication between the different pieces of electronics, the different devices on the end. Breakout fiber. So breakout fiber is also known as fan-out cables or fan-out fiber. This is where we have individual strands, multiple strands inside an outer jacket. So, in the most breakout fibers are going to be like a 4-strand where we can have, 4 different devices connected. Or if it's a transmit receive type application, 2 different devices connected. But those individual strands have heavy jacketing on them, so you can rip this cable open through with the ripcord, and you can take those individual strands longer distances. Now, we can compare this breakout fiber to a micro distribution fiber. So this fiber also has multiple strands. And usually the strand counts get pretty high. I'd say the most popular cable we're selling in a micro distribution is either a 6, an 8, or a 12-strand fiber. And these go all the way up to 24, 48, even 96 strand in this little cable that's the size of a pencil. Okay, you get a lot of fiber runs in these cables because they are so small and pliable. Now, the problem with a micro distribution is you can't take that cable and break it out very far distances because the jacketing is just simply so small. You got to make sure you're going into something like a micro distribution panel. These are the panels that you put in the racks. Or you go into like a DMARC box where you can take that micro distribution and break it out to the different the different ports, the different jacks. Or you can even take these micro distribution cables, connect them to a fan-out cable, a breakout cable essentially, and now we can go into, individual duplex runs and, go to the different rooms of the house. So there's different ways to accommodate the cabling, but micro distribution is really made to go to some sort of a breakout panel or a breakout box where now we can jumper into, more durable lines of cable. Very important slide. So there's two different types of fiber that you're going to run into, single mode and multi-mode. And these are a little counterintuitive, okay? The easiest way to think of this when you're selecting a fiber optic cable is single mode is for those applications over 1,000 feet, whereas multi-mode are for those applications up to 1,000 feet. Multi-mode fiber is what we see in 95% of the installations in the residential market. It's just predominantly multi-mode. Now, the fiber going to the demarc point, so if you have like fiber to the home, that's typically a single mode fiber because those cables are running, literally miles from house to house or from the junction boxes to the individual developments, okay? But once we get to that demarc, it's typically multi-mode fiber run in the home. Now, this is a little counterintuitive because people think, okay, I can go further distance. Single mode cable must be a bigger fiber, whereas multi-mode fiber, is probably a smaller fiber. That is not how it works. It's actually the opposite. A multi-mode fiber actually has a bigger core of glass, whereas a single mode fiber has a smaller core of glass. And the reason that single mode can go further with a smaller core is because we're dealing with light waves. We're dealing with optics. And if you think about how optics work, you are basically taking a laser and you are bouncing it over this piece of glass, this piece of glass with a reflective surface, and you're expecting that signal to stay in phase. A smaller core, a smaller piece of glass, keeps those signals in phase longer distances. Whereas that bigger core of glass, that multi-mode signal, or that multi-mode cable, it's easier for those signals to get out of phase because there's more room in the cable. So multi-mode typically maxes out at 1,000 feet, where single mode can go up to 20 kilometers. I mean, you got major distances with these single mode cables. So here's the thing. Single mode really can be any length. In a commercial installation, you almost always see single mode is the standard because it doesn't have to be in an application over 1,000 feet. It certainly can be in shorter applications. Multi-mode cable, okay? We tend to see this in the residential installations instead of single mode because the electronics that connect to the multi-mode cabling tend to be less expensive. So like an SFP module for networking or a twisted pair extender, these are all really, the optical engines for a multi-mode cable tend to be less. This is what drives us to use that in most residential installations. And it happens, it helps that most of our cable runs are less than 1,000 feet. But if if you come in, you ask us to build a cable that's going to go more than 1,000 feet, it will almost always be a single mode cable. So there's a couple of things. This is, for anybody who's familiar with Pixie, you know that there's kind of Pixie standards out there. And I almost always try to take the cabling standards and build those into my workshop trainings. This chart is a little misleading. Okay, this is a Pixie standard chart, and this shows the different grades of fiber. An OM grade, like OM1, OM2, OM3, and OM4, these are multi-mode cables. These are that 1,000-foot distance cables. OS1 and OS2 are single-mode cables. This is that 20-kilometer plus type cable, okay? Now, the Pixie standards say OM3 and OM4, these are the cables that you will buy today, the grades of glass that you will buy today, these are kind of the standards, will push a 40 gig signal, for example, 100 meters, 125 meters. 100 gig signal, this is what we need for 8K, only 100 meters, 125 meters. The Pixie standard comes out of the networking world. This is actually, and the problem with this chart, even though you will see this in a lot of literature out there, the problem with these charts is it's a reflection on the electronics. It's not a reflection on the glass, on the cable. The nice thing about fiber optic cable is you actually have all kinds of capacity available to future-proof. So that OM3 or OM4 cable, the cables that you are buying, off-the-shelf kind of standard from TechLogix, and these cables start at like $10. So I mean, we're not talking about expensive cables. These actually support up to 100 petagigs of data. That's 10,000 times more bandwidth capacity than a twisted pair cable. So the fiber cable that you're pulling has all the bandwidth we need for future-proofing signals in our lifetime. The electronics need to catch up. And this is where there's companies like TechLogix who are doing a lot of development on these optical engines, building the extenders that allow us to move signals. Now, today's technology, we're moving 4K, 4K HDR, 18 gig, up to 20 kilometers. We have the chips coming out for the 8K extenders where you're pushing those signals hundreds of feet. So don't worry about pulling fiber and limiting your bandwidth. Pull the cable, future-proof your installations. Electronics will catch up as new optical engines continue to evolve. So before we start getting into a little bit of the electronics conversation, let's make sure you understand the different types of connectors out there. There are 5 different types of fiber optic connectors. The good news is really only 2 are predominant in audiovisual installations. ST, MTRJ, and MPO connections. These are in broadcast. These are in data center type applications. These are really not touching that traditional AV. LC and SC style connectors are. Now, both connectors terminate in the same way. So if you learn how to terminate one connector, you can terminate the other. So it's very easy to flip back and forth between the two. Both have the same physical characteristics in terms of performance. They transmit the same amount of bandwidth. They really work in the same optical way. The difference is the size. An LC connector is becoming the most common connector, and that's because this is what's going on most network devices because it's smaller. You can fit more connections on the electronics. It's also what you're seeing on a lot of the fiber optic extenders because you can fit more connections on the devices. You can make the devices physically smaller. LC connectors cost a little bit more because there's a Lucent patent that's in play. But if you're doing anything with networking, with modern devices, you will be using an LC connector. SC style is what you see on like some of the older media converters, maybe some of the older network switches. This is a bigger connector. It's called a subscriber connector, SC style. Again, it terminates in the same way as that LC connector. It's really just bigger. Now, if you are going into an installation where you have, it's older, you have SC connectors on the cable, but you need to go into an LC device, the good news is you can buy a little $3 coupler and flip those connectors from one to the other. You can buy coupling cables that have LC on one end and SC on the other end. Again, the physical optical properties are identical. It's just the size of the connector based on the devices. If you are going to terminate your cables to, really try to future-proof or, just to put a connector on the cable or pre-wire with something, I always go with an LC connector. That is what you're seeing on most modern devices. Now let's talk about electronics. So extenders, and you see the fiber optic extender here on the right-hand side of your screen. This thing looks a lot like a twisted pair extender. The only difference is you got a fiber optic connection. There's really 2 different ways we are engineering these products. With external modules, so these are little, what they're called SFP modules that slide into the optical port on the network switch or on the extender versus an internal module. So extenders that have an internal module, we're physically putting the fiber optic connection on the board of the product. Two different ways to engineer your products. There are pros and cons to each. So if we physically put the connector on the board of the extender, we can pretty much take any bandwidth that's coming into that product. So, you know, that HDMI port supports 18 gig, we can push 18 gig through that optical connection. If it supports 30 gig, we can support 30 gig on that optical connection. If it supports 48 gig for our 8K, we can support 48 gig on that optical connection. Really the only limiting factor inside these extenders and, you know, these electronics is just what chipset we're using, right? Is it HDMI 2.0? Is it HDMI 2.1? There's just a processing chip in there. But the optics, the optical circuit is not limited. It's what goes in, goes out. With an external module, that is not the case. These external modules, these for the most part are limited to 10 gig, meaning we can only push a 10 gig signal over that fiber optic cable. The advantage to doing that is now we can conform to standard networking equipment because most network infrastructures out there are either 1 gig or 10 gig. By having different modules, we can adapt the product for different network infrastructures. We can run our signals, you know, through switches. We can do different things with the different cables. The other advantage is we can take a product that's made from multimode fiber and pop out that module and pop in a new module, and now all of a sudden we're not going 1,000 feet, we're going 20 kilometers. So you have more flexibility by being able to replace the module, but you do have to compress your signals from 18 gig or, you know, basically it's 4K 18 gig down to 10 gig. Two different ways to wire your installations, two different products on the market. It really comes down to what are you trying to do? Run over a network, run really long distances, or do we want it fully uncompressed for the theater? Everything is, you know, high integrity. In the networking world, two different pieces of technology you will run into, Gbics versus SFPs. Gbics are what we saw on a lot of older network switches. You may run into these in the field. Most modern network equipment uses SFP modules. They're called small form factor pluggable modules. This is what you're seeing on the network switches now. Those fiber ports, this is what you put inside those fiber ports. This is going to allow you to take advantage of a fiber optic run with those network switches. Extenders, really a lot of different technologies starting to hit the market now that allows you to use a fiber optic cable for AV. And there are HDMI only versions. As I mentioned, you can get these in, you know, fully uncompressed. You can get them in compressed modules. But here's where it gets really interesting. There are boxes now, and TechLogix was really one of the first manufacturers that did this. There are boxes that allow you to send audio, video, control, networking, you know, pretty much all the stuff that we would send over a copper cable, a twisted pair cable, we can now send over a fiber cable with that one exception of power. So we are building boxes that are extenders that look a lot like your HD-based-T extender, perform just like your HD-based-T extender. You just use a fiber cable instead of a twisted pair cable, and you push those signals literally miles. And these boxes, I mean, fiber extenders, I mean, these start at like $350, so the prices come quite a bit down on the technology as well. There are fiber matrices out there. I would be remiss not to mention that you can get into large size matrices. It's really not what we see in a lot of installations. What we are seeing are AV over IP. And this is another area where you're seeing a lot of development in the market. Lots of people are familiar with AV over IP-based distribution. Because it's IP-based, you can use fiber for it. And there are some major benefits of doing fiber-based AV over IP. Things like frame rate latency, right? 0 frame rate latency in these type of systems. Ultimate flexibility, where you can have as many encoders as you want transmitters, as many decoders as you want receivers. any topologies, any flex, any basically system setup. You can do this with these systems, but the big advantage you see of going to fiber is that zero frame rate latency, so everything's instantaneous. You can handle HDR signals, seamless switching. I mean, you can go through the list of why fiber delivers a better performance, and frankly, this is what we are now seeing on a lot of those mission critical and those larger installations, because people want fiber, people want the benefits that come with fiber. Before we kind of wrap up here and take some questions, I always get folks asking me, well, what do we run? Where do we run? What's kind of the best practice? So we have we call it our fiber optic pocket guide. It's a nice little small brochure, fits in your pocket. That'll show you some common applications. It'll show you how to terminate, why fiber, all of that kind of stuff. A lot of the slides you're seeing in this training deck, those are in that fiber optic pocket guide. Great resource for you. The cabling recommendations that we often see is pull duplex. 2 strands is going to give you pretty good coverage for most applications. If you want to go crazy, pull 4 strands. That's going to let you do networking and AV distribution. Now, there are boxes. We make boxes that will do network, AV, control, everything over that, duplex fiber. So it is possible. It just costs more for the electronics. What we're seeing in practice, most people are pulling duplex. They are pre-wiring with duplex now. They are buying it at 39 cents a foot. They are charging it out at $1.50 a foot, or $175 per drop is kind of a standard. That is just what we are seeing. It's kind of a nationwide commonality between different installations. So with that, are there any questions for me while I am on the line?
Anyone can type in up in the chat box too. If you have any questions, I can read them out.
Can everyone hear me?
Yep, I hear you.
Okay, thanks. You mentioned the fiber not being corrosive, susceptible to damage like that. Is there any lifespan? Does it become brittle after a while, or anything like that? Any degradation that way?
Yeah, great question, because traditionally fiber does become brittle. Traditional fiber that didn't have that polymer coating on it, the lifespan on that could be anywhere from days to months, maybe years. What would happen with the traditional fiber is when you pulled it, if it would get a crack in it because, you handled it too hard or the bend radius was too tight, you get a small crack, and then over time that crack would expand. If you put it in the ground and there was a freeze cycle on it, the compression could crack it, and then over time that crack could expand. So these modern fibers we're using in AV, they take the glass and they coat it with a polymer. By coating it with a polymer, it doesn't let any cracks expand, so we don't see that degradation in the cables that you're going to be using today. Basically, you pull a cable, you put it in the wall, you're going to have the same performance, 20 years from now that you have today. And that's one of the major advantages of going to these kind of polymer-coated cables that have surfaced really in the last 2 to 3 years. Expect to get anywhere from 25 to 40 years of life on these cable pulls.
Great, thank you.
Anyone else have any other questions? Well, I think we might be good. Thank you very much for your time.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks for inviting me. And like I said, there's a lot to learn around fiber optics. We're here to help. We try to make it really easy to understand.
Great. Well, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Cameron. Appreciate it.
Yep. Take care, everyone.
All right. Bye-bye.